The year is 1000 CE. Christopher Columbus won't be born for another 451 years. But right now, a Viking ship is cutting through the North Atlantic. 30 feet of oak and iron, a blood-red sail catching the wind. And the man standing at the bow? He's about to do something no European has done in recorded history. He's about to step foot on American soil. His name is Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, grandson of a murderer exiled from Norway. And he has no idea that he's beating Columbus to the Americas by nearly 500 years. This is the story of the first Europeans in America, the ones history almost forgot. And it's wilder than any Viking legend. So who is this guy? Here's the thing about Leif Erikson. He wasn't supposed to be famous. He was the son of arguably the most notorious Viking of his time. But he wasn't the wild one. Leif was different. His father, Eric the Red, total hothead, killed a man in Norway, got exiled. Killed more men in Iceland, got exiled again. That's when Eric sailed west and discovered Greenland. Not because he was exploring, but because he literally had nowhere else to go. But Leif was diplomatic, strategic, the kind of guy who thought before he swung his axe. Born around 970 CE in Iceland, Leif grew up hearing his father's stories about the strange lands to the west, Greenland, the icy fjords, the settlements Eric carved out of frozen wilderness. But here's where it gets interesting. Around 999 CE, Leif sailed to Norway. He met King Olaf Tryggvason, and that king, he converted Leif to Christianity. Now, imagine telling your Viking father, Eric the Red, that you've abandoned the Norse gods? Yeah. But Leif had something else on his mind. Because while he was in Norway, he heard stories, whispers, rumors from a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who'd gotten lost at sea 15 years earlier. Bjarni claimed he'd seen land west of Greenland, forested land he never actually set foot on because he was desperate to get home. And Leif thought, what if? Picture this. It's the year 1000. You're standing on a beach in Greenland. You want to sail west across the North Atlantic. You have no compass, no GPS, no maps, no weather forecasts. How do you even start? Here's the mind-blowing part. The Vikings were masters of ocean navigation. They used techniques so sophisticated, we're still figuring out how they did it. First, they read the sun. Viking navigators used something called a sunstone, probably a crystal of Icelandic spar that could detect polarized light. Even on cloudy days, they could find the sun's position. That told them east from west. Second, they watched the birds. Certain seabirds only fly within sight of land. Ravens, puffins. If you release a raven and it flies back to your ship, no land ahead. If it flies away and doesn't return, follow that bird. Third, they read the water, the color of the ocean, the temperature, the types of seaweed floating by. Viking sailors could look at the sea and know they were getting close to land. Fourth, they memorized latitude sailing. They'd sail to a specific latitude, say the latitude of Greenland, then turn and follow that latitude east or west. Keep the sun at the same angle. Keep the North Star at the same height above the horizon. It's called running down your latitude. And it works.
Leif assembled a crew of 35 men, battle-hardened warriors, experienced sailors, his own brothers. They loaded their ship, probably a Nar, a Viking merchant vessel designed for long ocean voyages, wider and deeper than a longship, built for cargo, not speed. Food, water, weapons, tools, everything they'd need to survive wherever they ended up. And in the summer of 1000 CE, they sailed.
They sailed west, into the unknown. For days, there's nothing but ocean, gray water, gray sky, the constant sound of waves against oak. Then, land. But not the land they expected. The first place they spotted was barren, flat, covered in massive stone slabs. No trees, no grass, just rock and glaciers stretching to the horizon. Leif looked at this desolate landscape and named it Helluland. Stone slab land. Modern historians are pretty sure this was Baffin Island, in what's now northern Canada, and Leif took one look and thought, nope, not staying here. They sailed on. The next land they found was better, slightly. It had trees, but they were scraggly, thin. The beaches were white sand. Leif named it Markland, forest land. This was probably Labrador, the southern coast. And while it was an improvement, it still wasn't right. Leif wanted more, so they kept sailing. And then they found it. Forests, thick forests, grass so green it looked unreal. Rivers, absolutely packed with salmon. You could practically walk across the water on their backs. And grapes, wild grapes growing everywhere. Leif Erikson stood on that shore and smiled. He named it Vinland, Wineland. This was worth the journey. The exact location of Vinland has been debated for decades, but most experts now agree Leif Erikson had landed in northern Newfoundland, Canada, the site we know today as Meadows. And here's what's incredible. This place had everything the Vikings needed: timber for repairs, salmon for food, pasture for livestock if they brought any. It was paradise compared to Greenland. So Leif made a decision. They'd stay for the winter. Now here's where archaeology becomes absolutely crucial to this story. Because for 900 years, this was just a legend, a saga, a story Vikings told around fires. There was no proof, no evidence, nothing. Historians assumed it was myth, exaggeration. You know how Vikings were. They loved a good story. Then, in 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Stein Engstad, started poking around Newfoundland. They were looking for Vinland, and at a place called Lons Meadows, they found it. What they discovered changed everything we knew about pre-Columbian history. 8 buildings, Norse-style construction, the same design Vikings used in Greenland and Iceland. These weren't Native American structures. The architecture was completely wrong for that.
These were Viking halls. Inside, they found iron rivets, the kind used in Viking ship repairs, a bronze cloak pin, Norse design, the kind Vikings wore to fasten their cloaks, jasper fire strikers for starting fires, butternuts. Here's where that gets interesting. Butternuts don't grow in Newfoundland. They grow further south, which means the Vikings were exploring beyond their base camp. And most importantly, bog iron smelting evidence. The Vikings were extracting iron from bog ore and forging it, making nails, repairing tools, setting up semi-permanent operations. This wasn't a quick visit. This was a settlement. The largest building, 75 feet long. That's bigger than most modern houses. It had multiple rooms, a central fire pit, sleeping benches along the walls. This could house 70 to 90 people. Think about that. 70 to 90 Vikings living in America 500 years before Columbus.
So, what was life actually like for these Vikings in Vinland? Let's put you there. It's early morning, November, the year 1001. You wake up on a sleeping bench in the Great Hall, furs piled on top of you. Your breath makes clouds in the cold air. The fire pit in the center of the room has burned down to embers. Someone needs to restart it. Outside, you can hear the ocean, the wind, the cry of gulls. You're 6 weeks sailing from the nearest Viking settlement in Greenland, 2 months from Iceland, 3 months from Norway. If something goes wrong, you're on your own. The men would spend their days repairing ships, forging nails, felling timber, massive timber they couldn't get in treeless Greenland, hunting, fishing, exploring the coastline. The women, yes, the sagas mention women came too, would cook, preserved meat, spin thread, weave cloth, maintain the settlement. This wasn't a military expedition. This was an attempted colony. They ate salmon, so much salmon, caribou, wild berries, the butternuts they found further south. Maybe they even made wine from those grapes, hence the name Vinland. But here's the thing. They weren't alone. The Viking sagas called them skraelings. It's not a nice word. It probably means screechers or wretches in Old Norse. These were the indigenous peoples of North America, the ones who'd been living there for 15,000 years. And now they had visitors. For the first encounter, it probably went something like this. Imagine you're a Viking. You're out exploring, mapping the coastline, looking for more grapes, more resources. And you see them, people. Dark-haired, dressed in furs and leather you don't recognize, carrying weapons you've never seen before. They're watching you, cautiously, curiously. You raise your hand, they raise theirs. For a moment, nobody moves. According to the sagas, and take these with a grain of salt because they were written down 200 years after the events, the first encounters were mixed. Sometimes trade happened. The indigenous peoples had furs, the Vikings had metal goods, iron tools, knives, things the indigenous peoples had never seen before. Imagine seeing iron for the first time if you're living in the Stone Age. It would be like magic. But sometimes, violence.
The sagas described battles, skirmishes, the indigenous peoples using what the Vikings called war slings, probably atlatls, spear-throwing devices that could kill from a distance. One saga describes Leif's brother, Thorvald Erikson, getting killed by an arrow to the armpit during a fight. That's pretty specific. Probably true. Here's what's important to understand. The Vikings were outnumbered massively. They had 35 people, maybe 70 at most if more ships came later. The indigenous peoples, thousands, tens of thousands, spread across the entire coastline. The Vikings had better weapons, better armor, but they were in someone else's territory. And that someone else wasn't going anywhere.
The archaeological evidence at Lonzo Meadows tells us something fascinating. There are no signs of a major battle, no mass graves, no burned buildings. The Vikings left relatively peacefully. They packed up, they sailed away, and they never came back. So here's the million-dollar question. Why did the Vikings abandon Vinland? They found paradise, endless timber, abundant food, good land. So why leave? Historians have a few theories. Theory 1, distance. Greenland to Vinland, 6 weeks of dangerous ocean sailing. 6 weeks! That's assuming good weather. No storms, no icebergs, no getting lost. You can't maintain a colony that's 6 weeks from your supply base. It's logistically impossible with Viking-era technology. If something goes wrong, someone gets sick, tools break, ships get damaged, you are 2 to 3 months from help. That's suicide. Theory 2, indigenous resistance. Here's the brutal reality. The Vikings were colonizers. They were taking land that already belonged to someone else. And those someone else's, they fought back. Every hunting trip was dangerous. Every exploration risked ambush. Every day meant looking over your shoulder. You can't raise children in that environment. You can't build a future when you're constantly defending yourself. Theory 3, numbers. Greenland itself only had about 2,000 Vikings total. You can't spare 100 people to maintain a distant colony when your home settlement is barely viable. The math just doesn't work. Theory 4, economics. This is the big one. What could Vinland provide that was worth the risk? Timber? Sure, but Greenland could trade with Norway for timber. Furs? The indigenous peoples had those. Grapes? Cool, but you can't build an economy on wine. There was no gold, no silver, no spices, no luxury goods worth dying for. Beat. Unlike Columbus 500 years later, the Vikings found a rich land, but not a profitable land. And that made all the difference. But here's the thing. Leif Erikson wasn't the last Viking to visit Vinland. Not even close. According to the sagas, multiple expeditions followed. Thorvald Erikson, Leif's brother, led an expedition around 1004 CE. That's the one where he died, killed by an indigenous arrow. Thorfinn Karlsefni, an Icelandic merchant, led a major colonization attempt around 1009 CE. Get this, he brought 60 men, 5 women, and livestock. This was a serious attempt at permanent settlement. His wife, Gudrid, gave birth to a son named Snorri. Snorri Thorfinnsson was the first European child born in the Americas. Think about that. 1,000 years ago, a Viking baby born on American soil. But that expedition also failed. same problems. Indigenous resistance, distance, logistics. They stayed about 3 years. Then they left. The last mentioned voyage to Vinland in the sagas happened around 1014 CE. After that, in silence. The Vikings stopped going. Vinland faded into legend, a saga, a story old men told their grandchildren. I remember when your great-great-grandfather sailed to the land of vines. Over the centuries, the story got muddled. Details changed. Locations were forgotten. By the time Columbus sailed in 1492, nobody in Europe even remembered that Vikings had already been there. Fast forward to the 20th century, Meadows is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You can visit it, walk the same ground the Vikings walked 1,000 years ago. The buildings have been reconstructed based on archaeological evidence, turf walls, timber frames, exactly how the Vikings would have built them. And the evidence? It's ironclad. Radiocarbon dating places the settlement between 990 and 1050 CE, exactly when the sagas say Leif Erikson was there. The artifacts are unmistakably Norse, the architectural style is unmistakably Viking. But here's what's wild. This is the only confirmed Viking settlement in North America. One. That's it. Archaeologists have searched for decades trying to find other sites, more evidence of Viking exploration. Nothing. Which means either the Vikings didn't explore much beyond Newfoundland, or they did, but left no trace we can find. Some historians think Vinland was actually much farther south, maybe Maine, maybe even Massachusetts. Those butternuts found at Lanzo's Meadows, they grow in New Brunswick at the closest. More likely, the Vikings got them from even farther south, which means they were exploring, traveling, trading. We just don't have proof yet. In 2016, archaeologists announced they might have found a second Viking site, Point Rosé, also in Newfoundland. They found evidence of iron roasting, a Norse technique for processing bog iron. But the evidence is controversial. Not everyone's convinced. As of right now, Meadows remains the only certain proof. One settlement, occupied for maybe 10 years, then abandoned. That's the entire physical legacy of Vikings in America. But the historical legacy, that's something else entirely. Now, we need to talk about the sagas. Because everything we know about Leif Erikson, it comes from 2 medieval texts. The Saga of Eric the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders. These were written down around 1200 CE. That's 200 years after Leif's voyage. Think about that. 200 years of oral storytelling, passed down generation to generation, embellished, changed, distorted by time. If I ask you to accurately describe something that happened in 1825, could you do it? That's the challenge historians face with the sagas. But here's what's amazing. The sagas got a lot of stuff right. They describe 3 lands, Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. We've confirmed those match actual geography. Baffin Island, Labrador, and Newfoundland. They describe the type of buildings the Vikings built. The archaeology confirms it. They describe encounters with indigenous peoples. That makes sense. The Vikings absolutely would have met them. But they also describe a lot of stuff that's probably exaggerated.
Epic battles, dramatic dialogues, heroic speeches. That's saga-style storytelling. It's meant to be entertaining, not a documentary. So historians have to sort through what's real and what's embellishment. It's like, imagine if the only record of World War II was action movies made in 2150. You'd get the broad strokes right, but the details? Questionable.
Okay, so here's the big question. Why didn't the Viking discovery of America change everything? Columbus showed up in 1492 and bam, the world transformed. Colonization, conquest, the Columbian exchange, everything changed. But Leif Erikson got there 500 years earlier, and nothing happened. Why? Reason 1, no follow-through. The Vikings made a few trips, stayed a few years, then left. That's not exploration, that's not colonization, that's tourism. You can't change world history with tourism. Reason 2, no communication. When Columbus returned to Spain, he had the printing press. News of his discovery spread across Europe in months. When Leif returned to Greenland, he had word of mouth. The story stayed in Iceland, Greenland, and Norway. It didn't reach the rest of Europe. It didn't reach the Catholic Church. It didn't reach the trade powers of Venice or Genoa. It was a local story that stayed local. Reason 3, no economic incentive. Columbus brought back gold, promises of spices, trade routes to Asia. The Vikings brought back timber and stories. Not exactly world-changing. Reason 4, wrong time, wrong place. In 1000 CE, Europe was in the early Middle Ages. The Viking Age was ending, Christianity was spreading, the Norse were settling down, converting, becoming farmers and traders instead of raiders. There was no Viking Empire with the resources to exploit a new continent. By 1492, Europe had nation-states, professional navies, banking systems, the Renaissance, the technology and organizational structure to actually colonize distant lands. The Vikings found America, but they found it 500 years too early. Now let's talk about something that often gets overlooked, the Indigenous perspective. Because from their point of view, this wasn't a discovery. This was a weird incident. Some strange pale people showed up in bizarre boats, wore metal, spoke a language nobody understood. They stayed for a few years, traded some, fought some, then they left, and never came back. For the indigenous peoples of North America, the ancestors of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, the Innu, this was just a thing that happened. Not world-changing, not revolutionary, just some foreigners who came and went. Their world kept turning exactly as it had. They kept hunting, fishing, living their lives. The Viking visit left almost no lasting impact on indigenous cultures. No European diseases yet. That horror would come with Columbus. No widespread trade networks, no cultural exchange. The Vikings didn't have the numbers or the staying power to affect anything. This is a stark contrast to Columbus. When Columbus arrived, he brought devastation, disease, slavery, conquest. Within a generation, indigenous populations were collapsing. When Leif Erikson arrived, the indigenous peoples probably barely remember the encounter. Maybe a few elders told stories. My grandfather said strange men came from the sea once. They had metal that could cut stone. And that was it. Scandinavian immigrants poured into America in the 1800s. Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, and they brought the sagas with them. Suddenly, there was this powerful narrative. We were here first, before Columbus, before Spain, before England. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson officially declared October 9th Leif Erikson Day in the United States. Not as big as Columbus Day, but it's there on the calendar. The Minnesota Vikings NFL team named after this heritage. Statues of Leif Erikson? They're all over the place. Seattle, Milwaukee, Reykjavik, Boston. And when the Angstads proved Meadows was real in 1960, it rewrote the history books, literally. Every American history textbook published after 1960 had to add a chapter. Before Columbus, there were Vikings. Of course, whenever you have a famous historical discovery, you get frauds. The Kensington Runestone. Found in Minnesota in 1898, a stone with runic inscriptions claiming Vikings reached the Great Lakes in 1362. It's fake. Modern linguistic analysis proved it. The runes use modern Swedish grammar. It's a hoax, probably created by Scandinavian immigrants wanting to prove their ancestors explored deeper into America. The Newport Tower, a stone tower in Rhode Island. Some people claimed it was a Viking structure. Nope. It's a colonial-era milled mill built in the 1600s. Sorry. The Vinland map. In 1965, a medieval map surfaced supposedly showing Vinland. Also fake. Ink analysis in the 1970s revealed modern synthetic compounds. Someone tried to forge a Viking map to cash in on the Meadows discovery. Here's the thing. People want there to be more Viking sites, more proof, more drama. But real archaeology is slow, careful, conservative. Right now, we have one confirmed site. Everything else is speculation until proven otherwise. Okay, let's play a game. What if the Vikings had stayed? What if Leif Erikson had brought 500 people instead of 35? What if they'd established permanent colonies up and down the East Coast? Would history be completely different? Maybe. Imagine, by 1100 CE, Viking settlements stretching from Newfoundland to New England. Trade routes established, regular contact between the Old World and the New. Would the Black Death have reached America centuries early? Probably. Would indigenous populations have been devastated? Almost certainly. Would there be a Viking-descended nation in North America today? Maybe. Or would the Vikings have been absorbed into indigenous cultures? Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, assimilated? We'll never know. Because they left, and that decision to abandon Vinland meant that when Columbus arrived 5 centuries later, he found a world that had no memory of European contact, a world that thought it was making first contact. Both sides surprised to find the other existed. Right now, today, archaeologists are still searching. Because here's what we know. The Vikings definitely explored beyond Meadows. Those butternuts, found at the site, don't grow anywhere near there. The sagas describe multiple lands, multiple expeditions. There's gotta be more evidence, somewhere. Modern technology is helping. Satellite imagery, LiDAR scanning that can see through forest canopy, ground-penetrating radar. In 2015, archaeologist Sarah Parsak used satellite imagery to identify possible Norse structures at Point Rose. The excavation is ongoing. The evidence is inconclusive, but they're looking. Other potential sites are being investigated. Baffin Island, maybe a temporary camp? New Brunswick, following those butternuts. Maine, some intriguing possibilities? So, what's the legacy? What did the Vikings actually leave behind in North America? Physically, almost nothing. 8 buildings at Meadows, some artifacts. That's it. But culturally, they left us a question. What does discovery even mean? The Indigenous peoples discovered America at least 15,000 years ago. The Vikings discovered it in 10 CE. Columbus discovered it in 1492. None of them were first to the land itself. They were first to their people. The Viking voyages prove something important. Cross-Atlantic contact was possible long before Columbus. Medieval ships, medieval navigation, it could be done. Which raises other questions. Were there other pre-Columbian contacts we don't know about? West Africans, Polynesians, Chinese. The ocean was never as much of a barrier as we assumed. The Vikings proved that. They stepped across the Atlantic 5 centuries before it became permanent. They proved it could be done. And then they went home. And that might be the most fascinating part of the whole story.
Let's do a direct comparison. Because understanding why Columbus succeeded where the Vikings didn't, that tells us everything. Ships. Viking Nar, 30 to 50 feet long. Open deck, 1 sail, crew of 30. The Spanish ships were bigger, more advanced, more capable. Navigation. Vikings, sunstones, stars, birds, memory, incredible skill, but limited. Columbus had a magnetic compass, an astrolabe, written maps, navigation instruments the Vikings never dreamed of. Backing. Vikings, personal ventures, family expeditions, maybe a jarl support. Columbus, the entire Spanish monarchy, King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella, the wealth of a nation-state behind him. Motivation. Vikings, resources for Greenland, timber, exploration, adventure. Columbus, gold, trade routes to Asia, spreading Christianity, national prestige, converting souls. Follow up, a few more trips, then nothing. Columbus, within 10 years, dozens of Spanish expeditions, permanent colonies, the conquest. See the difference? The Vikings were explorers. Columbus was the vanguard of an empire. One was a scouting mission. The other was an invasion. And that made all the difference.
So, why does this story matter? Why should you care about Vikings in America? Because it teaches us something fundamental about history. Being first doesn't mean being remembered. Leif Erikson got there first. Absolutely, no question. But Columbus changed the world. There's a difference. History isn't about who arrives first. It's about who follows through. It's about impact, connection, transformation. The Vikings touched America and left. Columbus touched America and stayed. And that decision to stay, to colonize, to connect the old world in the new permanently, that's what changed everything. But the Viking story also teaches us humility. How much history have we forgotten? How many discoveries were made and then lost? How many Leif Eriksons walked through history without anyone remembering their names. For 900 years, this story was a myth. Just an old saga, an exaggeration. Until 1960, when 2 archaeologists with shovels proved it was real. Which makes you wonder, what else are we dismissing as myth that's actually true? What other impossible stories are waiting for proof?
In the end, Leif Erikson's story is this. A man sailed west into the unknown, found a new world, explored it, named it, and then he went home. No conquest, no empire, no permanent change. Just a moment in time. A footnote that could have been a chapter. 500 years later, Columbus would sail the same ocean, find the same lands, but this time, the world would never be the same. The Vikings arrived too early, with too little, for too short a time. They proved it was possible. Columbus proved it was profitable. And that's the difference between exploration and colonization, between discovery and conquest, between a voyage and an empire. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, the first European to set foot on American soil, the man who discovered a continent and then sailed away. His settlement stood for perhaps a decade, then it was abandoned, reclaimed by wilderness, forgotten by history, until a husband and wife team of archaeologists dug it up and proved the impossible was real. The myth was memory. And 500 years before Columbus, a Viking stood on American soil. The story of Leif Erikson and Vinland reminds us that history is full of surprises. Meadows stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, proof that the impossible happened. If you ever find yourself in Newfoundland, visit it. Walk where Vikings walked 1,000 years ago. And remember, discovery is one thing. What you do with it, that's history.